So I'm Emily Firetog. I'm the deputy editor at Literary Hub, and I'm pleased to welcome you to the 2020 Brooklyn Book Festival. Today, we're going to speak with authors Laura Vandenberg, Emily Temple, and Lauren Francis-Sharma. The panel is called Women on the Verge. I'd like to note that books by these authors can be purchased at the link below. All right, so I'm going to start just by introducing you guys and reading your bios, and I have your books. So Laura Vandenberg is the author of the story collection, What the World Will Look Like When All the Water Leaves Us, The Isle of Youth, and most recently, I Hold a Wolf by the Ears. She is also the author of the novels Find Me and The Third Hotel, which was a finalist for the New York Public Library Young Lions Fiction Award and an Indie Next Pick, and was named a Best Book of 2017 by more than a dozen publications. She is the recipient of a Rosenthal Family Foundation Award from the American Academy of Arts and Letters, the Berg Fiction Prize, a Penn O. Henry Award, and a MacDowell Colony Fellowship, and is a two-time finalist for the Frank O'Connor International Short Story Award. Emily Temple's debut novel is The Lightness. Her short fiction has appeared in Colorado Review, Electric Literature's Recommended Reading, Indiana Review, Fairy Tale Review, and other publications. She is the managing editor at Literary Hub. Born in Syracuse, New York, she earned a BA from Middlebury College and an MFA in fiction from the University of Virginia, where she was the recipient of a Henfield Prize. She now lives in Brooklyn. And lastly, Lauren Francis-Sharma is the author of the critically acclaimed novel Till the Well Runs Dry, winner of the Honor Fiction Award from the Black Caucus of the American Library Association. Lauren's most recent work can be found in The Lily, Electric Literature, barrelhouse.com, and the San Francisco Chronicle. Lauren is a graduate of the University of Pennsylvania and the University of Michigan Law School. She is a MacDowell Colony Fellow and the Assistant Director of the Breadloaf Writers Conference. Her second novel, Book of the Little Acts, was published in May. So thank you for your patience while I read your bios. So let's get started. Our panel discussion description is pretty broad, and I think one of the reasons you three were brought together is because you're women, and the novels and stories that you write have women characters. And instead of looking at those female characters as characters with agency, we're asked to think of them as breaking out of a patriarchy box. And the problem with that, for me, is that it suggests that the only action these women can take is in reaction to men. And I think while many of your characters, or all of your characters, are aware that they live in a patriarchal society, it's something that they have to negotiate, fighting against it isn't the only thing that defines them, and it's the only thing that concerns them. And the narrative possibilities aren't determined by the fact that we live in a patriarchal society. So in the next 40 minutes, I'm hoping that we can use gender as a lens to talk about your characters and not be confined by the limits of it, if that makes sense. So just starting off, obviously, femaleness is not a monolith. That means characters are going to act in a certain way. But I'd love to think about how do you see yourself exploring femaleness and gender in your characters, whether that's girls at a Buddhist camp or a woman taking her elderly mother on vacation in Italy or a woman in Trinidad. So Laura, I thought we'd start with you.
Yeah, I do. I mean, I was interested in what you were saying earlier about that women characters being sort of aware that they're living in a patriarchal society, but not feeling like their only way of being in the world is sort of reacting against a patriarchal society. And with Wolf, one thing that I was thinking about quite a lot was really not only wanting the stories to center women in terms of the protagonist. That's also just kind of how I write. I just I'm working on a longer novel now that does have point of view characters who are men, and I'm like, wow, this is a whole brave new world. But I tend to be, particularly with short stories, like very voice oriented, and that is just the voice I hear, 99% 0.9% of the time, it's a woman's voice. And it's often a voice that is, in some ways, close to myself, close to women that I know, close to women in my family, and that's kind of what I'm following. But in Wolf, I really, in my previous collection, The Isle of Youth, a lot of those stories deal with women coming into conflict with a man in their lives. And while there certainly are, significant characters in Wolf that are men, I really wanted to write into the complexity of women-to-women relationships, mothers and daughters, sisters. I have sisters. Sisters are a perennially fascinating landscape for me as a writer. And also, neighbors, friends, that whole like landscape of woman-to-woman relationships. And I really wanted that to be the sort of central area of concern for this collection.
Emily, what about you?
It's so funny because I tend to think of women as the neutral. I know our culture tells us that the white male is like the neutral, repeatedly, but in my brain, it's women. Like, I have the same thing as Laura said, the voice in my head, it's always women. And to me, writing male characters is like, oh man, I have to try to think about what men are like. It's a little bit, despite the fact that all of the novels that I was raised reading in the system of education are primarily by and about men, somehow I just ignore them. But no. But yeah, in the Lightness, I sort of specifically wanted to take this well-known trend or I guess trend is not the right word for it, but trope of a charismatic male spiritual leader who is manipulating younger women, and see what I could do with it when, in the book, at least for me, it's not really about him after all. It turns out to be so much more about the female spiritual leader within the group of acolytes, and she is the real power. And it was important to me to have them. They're teenagers, so they're not even fully aware of the patriarchy. They're not even fully aware that like this is a trope that they're subverting. They are just coming into themselves and taking what they see and internalizing it. So I tried to sort of have that separation between me saying like, I know usually all the girls are obsessed with the male spiritual leader, but let them be obsessed with their female peer in the same way. But they're not going to know. They're not going to be like, we're subversive, because they're just brand new and trying to figure it out from a baseline, again, as like the neutral parties for their own lives.
And Lauren, the Rose's father is obviously a big part of the narrative, but do you see that her, like writing about her gender conflict and the reasons why she's like fighting against it is really important in the book?
I think that I think not until maybe the second or third draft, to be honest with you, when I begin writing, I'm less concerned sort of about the positioning of my character in the world as I am about sort of, making sure that her voice or his voice is heard. And I in both of my novels, I actually write in a male voice, and something about being a woman in this world makes me feel like I am fully capable of writing both men and women, because we are surrounded by them and living in a world that generally is controlled by them. And so in sort of the same way that I feel like as a Black woman, I sort of have an interesting perspective on white people as well, because I've been sort of in this culture, and I feel like I can capably write white people, men, in that same way. But but to be honest with you, by the time I get to the second or third draft and I start to really think about like agency and how I want this woman to sort of be positioned in the story that I've created, then I began sort of thinking about women in a more communal sense, right? And that we control sort of the emotional center of life, and so I really write from a place, I think, of power for my characters. This sense that even though they may be kind of mired in this patriarchy, that there is always this sense of agency, because I really do think we sort of move the engine. So.
Do you think that that's a sort of like subversive or disruptive way to write or way to think about your characters? Like going back to what Emily was saying, the novel is historically male. It's historically male characters, and yet, I mean, myself too. Like when I think about, like, I mean, it's ironic. We have 3 women novelists that we're talking to. Like, can we say that the novel is historically male now? But let's say it is a historically male space. Is it then subversive or disruptive to be writing about women and having that be the focus of your narrative?
Is that for me?
Yeah.
I don't feel that. But I also think that that's sort of, this, and perhaps I don't, not to say that I don't feel like the novel has been historically male. Yes, I do understand that. I feel that. But when I'm writing, I feel much more this sense of responsibility to a woman, and her being sort of the complete story, and not this sense that she's subverting anything. Emily sort of said this, right? Like there's no, there isn't that sense of subversion that's happening. And as my actors are acting, she is her whole world. And I feel like that's the way that we have to write women, right? In that she's taking up all this space. And then we can kind of analyze a little bit sort of how she positions herself with relation to men and the outer world. But, in my first draft, she is taking up all the air.
Mm-hmm. Laura, what do you think about kind of the importance of writing women and thinking of those female to female relationships? Does that subversive at all? Is it?
Yeah, I would say I would completely second what Lauren just said, where I think when I'm writing, it's like, I mean, particularly those early drafts, it's like a voice is, calling across the abyss, and somehow it finds me and I find it. And that's really what I'm following. And it's so rare to think of a work of fiction from like the outside in, to think about those sort of macro questions first. That if they come in at all, they tend to come in much later in the process. But yeah, those early drafts are just like trying to be as attuned to that voice as possible, and following that voice and seeing where it leads. And I'm not even sure that it's my role as the writer to sort of decide if what I'm doing is subversive or disruptive. I mean, I think, like, I wonder if in some ways that really is, if those determinations kind of belong to the reader. Or to whatever readers, meet the work. Because I think what is subversive and disruptive, it's also, I mean, that's a spectrum, right? Like what I find subversive and disruptive, another reader might find sort of not particularly subversive or disruptive. So I think for that reason, because like that is a kind of continuum of experience, it really, I mean, maybe in some ways that's sort of the reader's role to like bring that reaction to the work. I will say in Wolf, there's one, in terms of character, I do think that at a certain point in the process, I think a lot about, you know, how these women characters are situated in the world, how they are gazing upon the world, and how the world is gazing upon them in kind. And do think about sort of disrupting maybe expected conventions, or what I perceive to be expected conventions in some ways. And I think if there was a story in Wolf that came from the outside in a little bit more than the others, there is a story in there called Blizzards that's about the Kavanaugh hearings. Even though Kavanaugh isn't named, it's like very clearly the subject of the story. And I knew that I wanted to write about a couple having an argument. And I knew that I wanted to write about the hearings in some way. But even then, like that really did start with sort of a concept or an idea, more of an outside in. But even then, like, I really did not know what was going to happen in that story, or what the characters were going to do or say or withhold, and the ways in which they would sort of violate one another until it was actually happening. And I think that that's like, we write towards those sorts of surprises. And I feel like when I approach a story in a way that is kind of predetermined, like I wanted to do this or I wanted to do that, sometimes there's the risk of sort of shutting down the possibility of those kinds of surprises that can be really exhilarating. And it's kind of like, I don't know if y'all feel that way, but for me, it's like, I'm in it for those moments of surprise where I'm like, whoa, maybe that's too much. And then I'm like, no, that's just enough.
So when I'm thinking of like this patriarchy box, it is like this outside force. And the way that we're discussing it, it's kind of like these characters exist and the patriarchy is there, but like I'm not analyzing it as I'm writing, right? Like it's just something that exists in kind of the background. But I'm wondering if we're thinking of like these characters as almost like independent of social norms, they are still fighting against it. So like when I think about like Olivia and definitely Rosa and like all of these women, they're fighting against the social norms. They don't want to do what they are meant to do. And yet what they end up doing isn't really free of those social norms either. And if the patriarchy box, as we're calling it, doesn't play into the writing process, what is it like when then you look back at these characters and those forces are there, and they're not, they aren't able to like break out in the way that they had hoped?
Yeah, feels like the surprise that Laura that Laura just mentioned. You're sort of like moving your characters along, and suddenly they brace up against this thing, and it opens an opportunity, right? I mean, and to create sort of conflict and some surprise. You know, for Rosa, and I'm sorry, I don't know if this question was meant for me, but if for Rosa, I feel like as I was writing her as this sort of girl of the land and a horse girl, and you know, this very capable, strong young girl who her father sees as very capable and strong as well, and he wants to actually bequeath the land to her, but she's a woman, and he is stuck, right? Because the society is not actually allowing him to do what he thinks is best with his own land and for his own family. And that is when I realized I had an entirely different storyline going on here. And so, you know, like Laura mentioned, that was a surprise for me. And you know, it shouldn't have been, right? if I was thinking about it sort of outside in, but because I was, you know, kind of inhabiting this character, and then seeing that, you know, how I wanted her to live wasn't going to actually be possible. There were all these outside forces that were creating, you know, paths that were not of her choosing, and you know, and then she has to sort of create some agency to sort of make her own way off this path. But that's in some respects, writing that way creates so much more interest to me than beginning that way.
I mean, I think it's funny, as you were talking, Emily, and as you were talking too, Lauren, like, it's kind of as in life, so in writing, right? I mean, we don't think about ourselves as being constrained in the patriarchy box all the time as women. We're not like thinking about that as we think about, how will we go about our days and how we present ourselves, but it keeps imposing and it keeps coming in various ways, and it imposes limitations and it creates opportunities. But it's almost like you don't have to think about it as a woman writing about women characters, because it is so natural in terms of the way that we think about how different women are positioned in the world. So it's almost part of the fabric. I mean, it doesn't feel subversive because it's part of the fabric of how I imagine a full person living in a realistic world. It's, for good or ill, I guess. Probably ill.
For ill of the characters, but like for good of the narrative.
Right.
Yeah, definitely.
Do you have a favorite female character? Just as I was coming up with these questions, I was like, who are the characters that like when I'm writing or I'm reading, like that I kind of am drawn to as either like strong women characters or like characters that are kind of perfectly female in all of their foibles and like evilness. I know it's like,
I think since my most recent book was a story collection, I'm like going through I'm going through the Rolodex of the stories. I think a lot of like my women characters, like I'm a little bit scared of them, where they interest me, but I would not necessarily want to like invite them into my home for a long stay. I think I feel, even though in some ways that character's experiences are pretty far away from my own, in terms of like I don't have children, and that's a story that's in part about losing a child. But there's a story in the book called Hill of Hell. And I think that's, I would say that narrator is probably the one that I identify with the most strongly, just her sort of kind of sensibility and way of being in the world. And I hope that in some ways I would react to things differently than she would, but also in some moments I'm not so sure. So I think out of all the characters, that there's maybe like a slightly stronger identification there. And I would say the same for the narrator of Cult of Mary too. As someone who also has in fact taken my mother on a vacation, there was plenty to identify with there. I think a character whose lived experience is like wildly outside my own, but it was really fun to write, and that I came to sort of like admire in a strange way, is the narrator of Your Second Wife, which is a story about a woman who impersonates dead wives for bereaved husbands. And I found her to be like sort of, on the one hand, like kind of deranged, but on the other, sort of like awesomely like quick thinking and fleet-footed and resourceful and resilient. And it was a fun voice to write in. And that was a character where I was like, yeah, like if I was like really up against it and I could pick like any of these women to sort of show up and team up with me, I was like, I think I would pick that one.
Yeah, I think, and I'm not sure, like if you meant sort of outside of my own writing, but I think that when I think about when I was in college, I read Mama Day by Gloria Naylor, and I felt she has a female character, and it's sort of a male. It's narrated by there's a protagonist, male protagonist, and female protagonist who writes in both voices, and that character to me embodies so much of sort of what I want to put on the page. It's just this very sort of larger than life woman who kind of does this pull push thing with the forces around her. She comes from deep Southern roots, where there's this magical realism and this incredible, like, powerful woman force, and not to give the story away, that literally kills this man. And there's something about the way that she holds power in that story, and to me that is ultimately feminine, and I love it so much.
Yeah, I was thinking of Rebecca. I just read Rebecca for the first time. Somehow I hadn't read it until now. And when I finished it, I was like, is Mrs. Danvers the hero of the book? Like, she is the most wonderful and horrifying and alive character. I mean, it is a book that is so intensely in the mind of its narrator, who doesn't have a name, and it's so much about her thinking about this imaginary dead woman. And there's some things about that voice that I also thought were really instructive in terms of using the way a character thinks to move a story forward, the obsession basically as plot, which I love. But Mrs. Danvers, who like is much, I sort of knew about from cultural osmosis, but is just someone who is driven by passion and I mean just extreme emotion at all times, to the point where like she's acting so outside of the norm, and her force is such that she makes everybody else just accept it and act like that's normal, and just make space for her. And I like that as a driving principle for a character.
Yeah, I mean, that book is amazing, and she's terrifying, but in the best way.
Yeah. Also, can it be rewritten as a love story between Mrs. Danvers and Rebecca at the end? That's what I would like.
That's your next book, I guess.
Right.
So we have about 10 minutes left, and I want to think about the male characters that are in your books. The way that, so we talked a little bit about how like the patriarchy is always there for female characters. It doesn't need to be actively written. But when stories are from the female perspective, or kind of have these strong female characters, how do we then read the men? Does it change? Like, maybe that's like a way to go into the subversive element, because I just hate this idea that like women are just fighting against this force all the time. It's not, that doesn't drive the narrative. But if you look at like the protagonists of these novels and the stories, men are there, they're just not, we're not in their brains, really. Emily, do you want to start?
They're just not interesting. That's what I was going to say. But that's not true. That's not true, of course. I mean, it's tough, because I want to say, you just write men the way that you write other characters. And if you're going to have a realistic world, there are different kinds of people in it, and some of them are men. But I do think that when especially, the Lightness is first person, and so everything is filtered through a first person view. And at least for my narrator, men are very much other. they are this like sort of foreign, I mean, there's two men who are really important in the book, and one of them is her father, the narrator's father, and one of them is the gardener, who they are sort of obsessed with. And they get confused. She's confused whether they're the same person, or, you know, the borders between them blur. And part of that is that, you know, she mostly knows the society of women. And when you're a teenage girl, there are plenty of ways to be a teenage girl, but there is, you know, this sort of idea about the society of teenage girls. And so it's very foreign to her, and she approaches them like they're foreign. And so I sort of write them, I have, in this book at least, I wrote them to be these almost like, you know, almost, I was going to say almost like objects. And then I was thinking about how, in fact, I did think about the traditional male gaze of looking at different tiny parts of the woman and using that as if it's the whole woman. Like, look at her shoulder, it's so smooth and peachy. And that being, that's how I learned like what the male gaze was. And I did think about, I'm going to have Olivia look at different tiny parts of Luke's body and just meditate on his elbow crook. And that's going to be the way that she experiences him. And this is going to be the female gaze, because he is this sort of like alien creature that she wants to, you know, lick and stuff. So I don't know. That's how I thought about it. As like othering, but through the lens of character.
Yeah. You know, for me, I think, you know, my stories, because my male, I have one character who is first person, a man who's first person in the book. And he is half Native American, half white, but presents as a white man, at least as he's walking through the world, but had a very early experience as someone who's not a white male in the world. And, you know, and the son of my main character is a Black boy growing up in, you know, on Bighorn Mountain. And he's being raised in a community of people that don't look like him. And the father of my character is a fairly successful blacksmith on the island of Trinidad, and but he's a Black man. And so where, you know, I tried to write these characters, you know, keeping in mind that they too are victims of the patriarchy. And I think I remember that. I think I try to remember that with every man that I write about. You know, this idea that they are required and forced to live up to certain, you know, ideas of masculinity and you know, greed and all these things that we sort of associate with the patriarchy and what that does to them. And I think, I don't know, you know, I don't know if it's a successful thing, if I don't know if it's true, but I do think that that as women, writing about men in that way allows us to I don't know, you know, so it allows us to remember that this oppressive institution that we live within, no one escapes that, you know, and the same, you know, my story has a lot to do with sort of slavery and racism, and that mars everyone as well. We cannot escape it, whether we are Black or white or otherwise. And so I treat gender in that same way.
I think, you know, I was thinking that, I mean, I think of the stories in Wolf as being kind of like haunted stories, stories that often deal with the fantastic and the supernatural. And I think that there's often a kind of spectral quality to the men in the stories, which is to say, I mean, to me, the most significant male characters are off stage. So they never actually enter into the stage of the story, but yet at the same time, their presence is really felt. So there's one story, Carolina, where it concerns a woman is in Mexico City for a conference, and she comes upon her her former sister-in-law, who has been living in Mexico City and has been displaced by an earthquake and is currently unsheltered, and they sort of spend this night together. And the really deeply, powerfully fraught thing between them is how the sister-in-law's marriage ended in violence, with the narrator's brother and the narrator's sort of complicity in that, in terms of like not believing this woman, you know, in her own family, when she sort of tried to reach out and say, like, this is what's happening. And, you know, we never meet the brother. We never hear from him. He doesn't even pop up via like a text or a phone call. But to my mind, at least in that story, he has this really powerful ambient presence. And I think, you know, similarly with Lizards, a story that I talked about a bit earlier, I mean, Kavanaugh never actually like pops into that story, thank goodness, in a literal way, but it is this sort of like overwhelming ambient presence that permeates everything. And I think, you know, I was interested in that, that idea of how some of these male characters could be sort of nowhere and everywhere simultaneously, because when we talk about living inside of these power structures, you know, I do think that is sometimes how it feels. Like sometimes it can be really, you know, difficult to, you know, on a day-to-day basis to sort of, right, like it's not necessarily something that we're always thinking about or acting in response to, and yet these power structures do kind of permeate day-to-day life in all kinds of ways, some of which are really visible, and kind of we can identify them in a relatively straightforward way, and other ways in which are very slippery and kind of like hard to get our kind of a grasp on. You know, did that really happen? That sort of category of experience. And so that was something that I was thinking about that a lot, with the male characters, the way that they could be kind of nowhere and everywhere, there and not there, and what that quality had to express about the power structures that we live in.
I think we are almost out of time. This was a really great conversation. I feel like the world that we're living in now is so hostile and scary for everyone to just simply exist, and talking about the power structures that are actively working against us all the time is sobering and but still important. And I'm glad that you guys are continuing to write, thinking about like this realistic world that we need to analyze basically on a daily basis to survive. Sorry that got dark.
Okay, it's
a dark time.
It's where we are. Yeah,
really dark. But
in the news.
Thank you guys so much. I am just going to say, everyone, please remember you can order the books in the link below, which I assume will appear. And also, please consider making a donation to the Brooklyn Book Festival, which is celebrating its 15th year of presenting free literary programming. So thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you guys.
Thank you all so much. Thank you.